Welcome, everybody, to the launch of the book for Assets in Common. Throughout this event, you will hear from 4 out of our 5 co-authors of this book. We have here with us today Derek Razzo, Charity May, Jay Standish, and myself, Chelsea Robinson. I also want to acknowledge Zoe Schlag, who can't be with us today, but is also a co-author of this book. And again, with acknowledgements, this project would simply not have been possible without the partner organizations on your screen today. Purpose US, Common Trust, One Project, and the team that we stood up dedicated to this project, Infrastructure for Shared Ownership. We all see it as an immense privilege to have been able to conduct this research and to serve community and business leaders across this country with economic transformation. We do not take that privilege lightly, and I hope you can see that throughout our event today. Charity and I will be co-hosting. Charity, would you like to add a few words?
Hi, our time today we will be explaining the core arguments of the book, as this is the first time we're kind of going live with the findings, and we'll share more about the origins of the research behind it, and highlighting 2 of the case studies from the research with a panel with Don McGee and Aaron Johnson speaking on behalf of their organizations. Again, just reiterating what Chelsea mentioned, the builders in the field are the real leaders. So those of you that are out there trying to figure out ways to build a more equitable and resilient economy, and we want to highlight you, as many of you are here today. So again, we're very grateful that Aaron and Dawn are joining us during this live discussion, but also want to note that there are many other interviewees that participated in the research project that are in the room with us today. I think I saw Phil from Living Economies Trust, and Dan Fireside, and others that are here. I think Joseph Puritan from Open Cooperative as well. So you all are doing amazing work and demonstrating what is possible. So we're very grateful for that. A few housekeeping items. Please remain muted. As Derek mentioned, this is not a webinar format, so please remain muted throughout the event unless called on during Q&A. And feel free to use the chat extensively to discuss the core concepts that are raised throughout the event, or even post questions. We will have a Q&A session a little bit later during our time here. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Charity, and welcome to everybody. So now I would love to pass to our first speaker, Derek Razzo, who is the co-founder of Common Trust and also of Purpose US, to help talk about how did this project come to be.
Awesome. Thanks, Chelsea. I'll talk very quickly. So we've been running Purpose US now for a little over 5 years. And so we've got this amazing opportunity to work with hundreds of business owners on transitioning into shared ownership and steward ownership structures, as well as community leaders around the country who are using these strategies as a method for doing community economic development. And because we've had that front row seat, we've had the opportunity also to see all of the challenges in the sector up close. Challenges including scaling, where each new model requires a huge upfront investment in order to actually build, and scaling up your capital access also rewards standardization and defaults that a lot of these models intentionally don't have. Access to financing. Another barrier is models to point at, and like first risk takers in a lot of these situations. We'll talk a little bit about that today, I think. And a key barrier that the book really highlights is the challenge of not having shared infrastructure. So, small is beautiful, but big is harder to break. And so one of the questions that we are asking throughout this book is how can we find and promote models that actually get the benefits of scale without giving up control and while actually keeping wealth local? And so these are the types of challenges that we were kind of going into this research project trying to understand how people are solving them. I think the research showed that there are many amazing models, and we're going to hear about a few today. I'll just say that this research project, as Chelsea said in the book, is a collaboration between Common Trust, Purpose US, as well as One Project, who's been the kind of funder of a lot of this research. And the key reason for doing this is what we found through working with hundreds of business owners and community leaders around the country is that there are these kind of key unlocks that are going to be necessary for the next phase of the sector's growth, that we were finding people run into again and again. And what we wanted to do is actually build something, do a piece of research that is actually for the builders, to say, like, for people who are doing things, who are out there, who are making these models happen in their communities, in their regions, in their companies, what can we look forward to in the next phase of this movement as we grow, to actually scale these efforts in a way that doesn't just replicate the same challenges that the current system has.
Thank you so much, Derek. I'm just going to speak briefly about what is the core message of this book, because it is a Mary Poppins bag of ideas. And as anyone who may be here has potentially already downloaded and read through the book, I know some of you have, there's so much in it. So I just want to distill a couple of the key pieces of it, and then I'm going to pass to Charity and Jay to kind of expand on that before we go to a panel with Dawn and Aaron. So I've got a couple of words on the screen here to build on what Derek said. These key ideas: steward ownership, shared ownership. We know that the American economy is excited about combating monopoly and over-extraction from our communities using tools like alternative ownership. Now, we also know that steward ownership and shared ownership are having their heyday. There is so much growth in these sectors. However, we are noticing as well, like Derek said, once business owners do transition to some of these formats, there are still incentives at play in the economy that can hold these kinds of entities back. So how do we take these sort of little islands or individual units of an alternative economic paradigm and stitch them together to collectively create a competitive alternative economic ecosystem where they can lift each other up and help each other out? So in order to look into this, we wanted to see what was already working. We looked at probably between 30 and 40 case studies internationally, historically, locally, from the present moment. Huge diversity, size, big, small. These are the dozen case studies that we ended up putting into the book with in-depth analysis associated with them, because they were the ones that really demonstrated that breadth and depth of different models that we wanted to show what was possible. Across all of these amazing examples, we see a ton of different models and tactics coming out. We see very promising evidence that if each of us here on this call today, were to turn to the business to our left and to our right, or up and down our supply chain, or down the road from us on our main street, and looked at consolidating and connecting some of our assets together, whether those assets be land or human resources or equipment, then we would be able to potentially have more resilience together as a result. And I think the examples today that you're going to hear from Aaron and Dawn will exemplify that. So we'll hear about holding companies, and we also hear about in the book shared services companies that focus on making it cheaper and more efficient for people to operate together as well. There are a ton of more nuanced and technical pieces to this. There's cross-shareholding designs, business-to-business marketplaces, even the bespoke design of banks dedicated to small groups of companies. We're talking in the book about supply chain integration and the different ways that we can offer finance between our different assets, because it is so often the case that the big players in our economy can take advantage of the ups and downs and volatility of the markets, but sometimes the smaller players can't. But if we banded together, sometimes we can buffer each other from that as well through things like supply chain integration. We also cover municipal strategies. This isn't just about small business, although small business is a big emphasis of this book. And we also look at how nonprofits and trusts can play a role in owning business networks to protect them and support mission alignment in the long term. I'm going to now hand over to Jay and Charity to take us one step deeper and put a couple more meat on the bones here. We realize this is a little abstract at first, but trust me, it'll get clearer as we get into our examples. Here are some of our success factors that we also found throughout this work.
Thanks, Chelsea. And to loop back to this core idea of how do we unlock the benefits of scale while driving positive outcomes in the world, there are two strategies or sort of tactics that I want to touch on. And the first is this idea of a shared services cooperative. And the idea here is that multiple organizations would pool together to have a function, say an HR function or a marketing function, that instead of having a dedicated team within just their organization, they will share a marketing team, for example, that say 10 or 12 different organizations that might have similar business models, or they operate in a region together, pool together to share that service and own it cooperatively and govern it cooperatively. And so sort of branching off of that, if you imagine a group of organizations that were together in a holding company, they might also have shared services, but it's more of an internal shared services function. And this is one of the reasons we found conscious consolidation to be a really powerful model and tactic toward these ends. And so if we think of the amount of corporate consolidation that's happened in the economy over the last 30 some odd years, how can that same sort of approach be repurposed toward pro-social outcomes? And so examples of holding companies that are perhaps a cooperatively owned holding company or a steward-owned holding company that's specifically focused on driving positive outcomes in the world, rather than just purely sort of building a larger and larger balance sheet for private wealth accumulation. So Charity, I'll pass it on to you.
Hey, Jay. Yeah, I will just spend a couple of minutes highlighting two other key success factors that you'll also hear from our live examples today. But the first one being seed assets. And this was a really interesting find across several different case studies where businesses or community leaders have analyzed and identified within their context what specific assets they can bring to the table in service to a larger or broader goal. And it can be quite diverse in terms of what that asset could be. It could be a digital platform, so a platform services business that can create a B2B marketplace or even come up with a complementary currency. That's one of the case studies that's in the book. It could be underutilized real estate within a particular city or region. We see that being a seed asset that unlocks immense value from the public sector in the form of an urban wealth fund. It could be a strong balance sheet. There are examples of different financing strategies where one entity holds a stronger balance sheet, but leverages that balance sheet on behalf of smaller enterprises or on behalf of their supply chain. So the seed asset itself creates a lot of, if the community and the businesses identify what those seed assets might be for them, being able to activate those for this broader vision of interacting in the economy is really powerful. We've seen that in the research. The last one we'll highlight here is regionalism and place. Time and time again, a lot of the questions that were being raised by the builders, by the historic case studies, and some of the newer ones or modern ones, was that the solutions really came from people knowing, being rooted and knowing the context of their place. And that story of their landscape, of historic generations, cultural considerations as well, really determining the shape in which they went about seeking solutions to manifest a different way of operating the economy. Just to name a couple in the book that are really fascinating, one that's probably more well-known, that we drill into from a couple of different angles, is the Madrigal Cooperative in the Basque region of Spain, and also the Keiretsu model, which is in the Japanese context, a corporate conglomerate model that allows for diversified businesses to work together. So again, a lot of examples of within a particular place and local community, that story of really defining the pathway that they take to come to a solution. And I will pass it back to Chelsea.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. Yeah, so as you can see, there is a ton in this book, and if you are slightly lost right now, do not fear. We also, on our website, assetsincommon.org, have a ton of podcasts, blogs to expand on this, to make it much easier to understand. Don't put your pressure on yourself to understand all of it up front, because we certainly didn't understand it all up front either. In order to make this super accessible and really easy to understand, I'm so excited for Charity to host a short panel with Erin and Dawn. It's been so much a privilege and so much of an honor to be able to work directly with people who are leading community initiatives like this on the ground. And this short panel today is really going to help us highlight the importance of that kind of leadership. So back to you, Charity.
Chelsea, I'm going to first start by sharing a brief bio for our panelists, starting with Don McGee. So Don McGee is joining us as the CEO of GoodWorks Venture, which is a Montana-based company investing in high social impact companies within the region. She's also the president of the High Stakes Foundation, which provides support to visionary people and organizations that are leading and implementing changes to create a sustainable future for Montana. And Erin Dawson is joining us as the Workplace Development Senior Director for the Industrial Commons, where he leads the efforts to create and sustain worker engagement programs. He also assists in cooperative development for the Industrial Common enterprises and employee ownership transition for businesses thinking of selling to their employees. He has 15 years of experience as well, previously with Equal Exchange. So thank you again, Dawn and Erin, for joining and being willing to share from your specific experiences and the stories. And so we're going to dive right into our questions. And the first one, I would like to invite both of you individually to briefly describe the business ecosystem that is your company.
Sure. The business ecosystem of Montana, I always like to put geography first. We're a state that's almost as large as California, with a population about the size of Oakland. We are historically a mining and extraction place, and our biggest export out of the state was generally our super smart kids, because if you had ambition, you went somewhere else. So about 20 years ago, we started investing in impact enterprises, building a technology economy, and creating jobs, which we did successfully over the next decade, in conjunction with a number of people across the state. But after 10 years had gone by and there was jobs that you could secure here, we read an article in the newspaper that a man who had been manufacturing tarps, high-end tarps for trucks and boats, in a small rural place, population 2,000, had died, and 10 jobs disappeared overnight. And we kind of woke up from that and took a look around our state and worked with the governor's office to figure out, like, how many times is this going to happen in our state with like the enterprises we actually have that are already existing, as opposed to startups, because people are pretty abysmal about making plans for their own transition and their company transition, and 10 jobs go away and the local hardware store goes away or the local grocery goes away in a rural community. And we got pretty hip to the impact of that. And things always start around our office with somebody should do something about that. And so the somebody was us, and we formed another company called GoodWorks Evergreen for the explicit purpose of buying and holding businesses that were vital to our rural economies. And we started about 7 years ago. We have bought 7 businesses, and our first businesses was called Don's Hardware, which we bought the business and had the closing transaction on Don's 75th birthday.
Don, for that additional context of the ecosystem for GoodWorks within Montana. Erin, I'll pass it to you to share.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. I too like to start with kind of geography and place. The Industrial Commons does come out of kind of Western North Carolina, which has a traditional industry of textiles and furniture manufacturing. And so one of the big kind of impetuses for the work we're doing today was our founder, Molly Hemstreet, who was born and raised in Western North Carolina, born and raised in the town that our organization is based in. During the 90s, NAFTA came in and a lot of our jobs just left. I know people who had textile companies who had hundreds, over 100 employees the summer of 92, and by the end of 93, they had like 15, right? So it was pretty clockwork. So 2008 also kind of was one of the final nails in the coffin for our industries. And Molly Hemstreet was teaching English as a second language. Molly Hemstreet, born and raised in Morganton, North Carolina, went to Duke for biology, came back teaching English as a second language, had also been doing some rural organizing. And a lot of the students that she was teaching were having a hard time concentrating because when she inquired, you know, their home lives were somewhat of a wreck. They didn't have stable jobs, they didn't have stable hours. And so she was fortunate enough to be in two places. One, a region that has textile history, and two, close to a guy named Frank Adams. So Frank Adams was a worker co-op kind of I don't know, brain trust as a sorts. And then she had mentors in the textile industry, and both of them were saying the same thing, which is you should start a textile worker-owned textile manufacturer, and it should be in the cut and sew industry, because that's where the barrier to entry is pretty low, but if you work hard, you can make a decent profit margin. So it all spawns and stems from that, and we've built up an ecosystem of interrelated textile organizations. We have a textile worker co-op, and we also have a kind of a producers co-op of other textile manufacturers in our region. So it's really all for ours based around textile manufacturers.
Amazing. Thank you, Aaron. And I just want to kind of drive the message home from both of your descriptions of the region and the place. Again, how one of the success factors in being able to identify what the needs were or what the needs are of that particular neighborhood and community, and build in being able to develop an enterprise approach, Aaron, in the story that you just described in terms of starting a new enterprise to meet a specific need within the textile industry. And Don, your approach, your organization's approach in terms of holding and preserving a firm that was on the brink of jobs going away within the hardware industry. So again, highlighting that regionalism connection and approach, which is just a really powerful tool. I'd like to, Don, maybe invite you to drill in just a little bit more on the strategy related to, Jay mentioned this conscious consolidation, and why the holding company and the acquisition strategy made the most sense in terms of, you know, identifying this first need and taking that approach as opposed to any other approach. Kind of, could you share a little bit more about the thought behind that?
Sure. I'd like to tell you it was enormously strategic from the get-go, but it was not. We basically said we want to buy businesses that are vital to our rural communities. We want to make sure that they're Amazon proof and AI proof, that we're not going to lose them over the next couple of years because of changes in technology or having to go head to head with Walmart or somebody like that. And we had a relationship with Don, the guy who was selling the business. One of my team knew him, and it was just seemed like a logical first acquisition when we sat down and talked to him. It was an hour from our headquarters office, so that it wasn't difficult to get to. And we thought, well, let's start there. We had no intention when we first started of consolidating in a singular vertical. We thought we were just going to consolidate businesses in a holding company kind of bucket, but we didn't think that we were going to buy 4 hardware and lumber yards and then do adjacent products. But once we bought the first one, we were approached by the next group of people who wanted to sell their hardware store in an area which was about 3.5 hours away from our home office. And we decided, well, we are starting to learn this industry and business. Why don't we continue with these acquisitions until it no longer makes sense? And I think it was right time, right place. We're a once in a lifetime opportunity for a number of people who are in their late 60s, early 70s or mid 70s that wanted to get out of their businesses. And we were able to buy up a bucket of businesses that, as it turns out, was a great strategy for a number of reasons. One, we were enormously lucky during the time of COVID that hardware and lumber were considered an essential business, so we did not have to close our operations down. Two, the economy of scale and purchasing power, and also being able to have manpower switch from places to places, has really served to our advantage in that particular industry. And we, learned a lot about a single vertical, which was, I think, a lot easier than trying to figure out how to run a manufacturing enterprise on one hand and do something else on the other hand that was all unrelated. So we wound up buying 7 business enterprises that were either in or adjacent to the hardware space.
Amazing, thank you. I love the emphasis on, and it was an organic response as opposed to the top-down strategic approach. Thank you for that response. Aaron, I'd like to invite you to maybe shed a little bit more light on the seed asset that you were highlighting. The cut and sew worker directed cooperative that Molly Hemstreet was pursuing. Could you share a little bit more about what was that seed company and elaborate a little bit more on how that allowed for the other network partners to really organize and come together and build what is now the Industrial Commons?
Yeah, thank you. And first, just a appreciation to be on this panel with Dawn. Dawn, I've not met you before today, but just, a lot of what you're saying just resonates deeply with our work. One, if a job goes or a company goes away in a rural location, those jobs will be lost forever. It's not like another shop will open up in its place. So that resonates deeply. And then also the strategy, and I'll talk about this, of it's not just place-based, it's also sector-based, right? Because if you start with a textile company, you can apply a lot of the learnings of what you're learning from one company to another. You can also apply all of those contacts, all of those resources, all of those buyers, right? So getting to the question that you asked, that is why, I try to talk to any group who's like interested, like I want to do cooperative development, or I want to do what the Industrial Commons does. And just know, Molly did the blood, sweat, and tears, right? So she had started Opportunity Threads 8 years before the Industrial Commons, or 9 years before the Industrial Commons ever came about. I was one of the first full-time employees, but it was because she had literally put in the blood, sweat, and tears to start a successful cut and sew factory. So cut and sew, you have a product that you want a shower curtain and you want it to have your brand name on it, but you don't know how to cut it, you don't know how to sew it. You send it to Opportunity Threads, they cut and sew it, they put your label on there, goes back to you for you to retail. So that was the operation. As I noted, because Molly had industry experts in her community, including like the head of the Manufacturing Solutions Center, which was an NC State Textile Innovation Center, was the head of that was her high school swimming coach, right? So that's where the place-based matters, right? You find what's unique to your region because the people there will understand the industry itself. So she was able to find a place in the sector that would allow her for a few sewing machines to get started up, and then employee ownership offered this opportunity of investment from the workers, engagement by the workers to create quality products, right? To do it in a way that is timely, and through that quality product that was done on time and done well. I think their error rate still is about 0.3%, right? Not 3%, 0.3%. They were able to slowly add more and more clients and figure out, again, the right clients to build a profitable business. They, in 2020, bought their 30,000 square foot manufacturing center with 90% cash down. So that successful enterprise became the proof of concept. We're not some idealistic utopianists who are like, yeah, someday we'll have workers on the floor and they'll own the company. Like, we have a company that has over 40 workers and over 20 worker owners. That original worker-owned company, successful worker-owned company, allowed us to bring funders, and we'll talk about that in, I think in a bit, but allowed us to bring folks who wanted to see us do more of this work, allowed us to raise capital around it. But again, it started with a successful business first and then a network, not the other way around. And everything we've done because we saw a need with Opportunity Threads. We saw a need within the textile industry with our region. We saw a need around textile waste in our region, and we created enterprises or institutions to meet those needs. So it's entrepreneurial at its base, right? It's create a cooperative to solve the need of the enterprise that you have created. And it all started with creating successful, stable jobs, good jobs with good pay.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for that, the emphasis on the need to have the seed assets you're identifying, right, was a stable, successful business enterprise with a creative structure put in place, but the need to have that company kind of moving forward. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask both of you to answer this next question. We're going to pivot to talk a little bit more about capital. So I think Derek alluded to this a little bit earlier in the opening remarks about this, the challenges that are facing this the space and the need to come up with new ways of interacting and businesses coming together. There's always a need for capital in some form or fashion to really make it happen. And so would love to invite Don, maybe if you could speak first to what types of capital can be sourced to activate these types of networked approaches, and speaking from the specific experience that you've had. And then Aaron, would welcome you to follow that. To shed more light on the role of capital and the different types of capital that need to come together to make this possible.
Yeah, what I want to emphasize is that while there's a capital need for, being able to buy out owners, the capital needs are not particularly intensive for these kinds of businesses simply because there is no competition for them. They're too small for private equity to consider a roll-up. Owners are fairly desperate to get out. Some of our owners wanted to sell for health reasons, and that was an immediate challenge facing them, as opposed to like, I could wait 5 years and sell this business later. So we have a family office, and so our initial source of capital came at the time we started this from a bond portfolio that was producing about 0% rate of return. And I went to my board and said, hey, I think we have the opportunity to generate about a 5% interest rate regularly if we take some of our assets that would otherwise be dedicated to a bond portfolio and put them towards this. And I will just say my board took some convincing to like get around their heads around the notion of like, this is a great idea that we should be doing as opposed to investing in the people who do the doing. It really moved us from a company that was actively making grants and making investments in other people's companies to setting up and running our own company. And there was quite a bit of Sturm and Drang and concern and angst and all the things that go with that, because running a company, I'll just say this, it's not easy. Basically, you're solving problems and dealing with people, and people create more problems on the regular. And if you don't have appetite and or capacity to get up every morning and go face that, this game's not for you. It's in one way, we had more agency over our own lives because we were the actors as opposed to investing in people who were doing the doing. But that also put the problems directly at our own doorstep. And it's not for the faint of heart, I'll just say that. So our initial bucket of capital was $3 million from our own portfolio, with which that we bought our first 3 businesses. So I'll just say this about the businesses we bought too. We did not buy turnaround situations. We did not buy companies that were not, they were making money on the day that we bought them. They were also fairly fossilized in terms of the owners' capital investment into those businesses for the last 10 years. They were cash cows that owners took cash out of, that they knew that they were getting old, that they weren't reinvesting in, that there was no technology, there was no economies of scale. And so we were able to buy those businesses essentially for asset value. We made the owners take paper back. They carried a note. And then we invested some cash on the barrel. We have subsequently invested a lot more dollars, have a lots of line of credit, but have really brought the businesses into the 21st century, and they continue to make money. In order to do our next couple of acquisitions, we needed other people's money. So again, this is in a place where the interest rate environment at that particular time was about 0%. So the game has changed a bit. At the time we went to go get other people's money, we really didn't want to complicate our capital stack by putting in a preferred series that would force us to sell or liquidate the business over time. So we set up an investment structure that really acted like a 10-year treasury note. We basically pay a fixed return to our preferred equity investors. We raised about $2.5 million of other people's money through this structure. And we pay those investors 5%, and we pay quarterly with a 10%, with the principal being due in 10 years. So we basically, there was a lot of people who had cash on the side that was like, you can pay me like an old school treasury note? Great, I want in. The landscape's obviously changed substantially since that time, but I think there's a lot of creative ways for raising capital around these kinds of investments, including from your foundations through program-related investments, your community foundations in particular, and your state governments, which should have every vested interest in keeping these jobs and these people in place.
Well stated. Thank you, Don.
Just going to jump in and do a quick time reminder here that we're going to need to wrap up this panel in just a minute.
Chelsea, Aaron, if you're going to take this last question, and then we'll be rounding out this panel.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I mean, essentially, it really started with a few sewing machines in Molly Hemstreet's closet, and I think some money from the Adrian Dominican sisters. So that was what got her off the ground. Now, we have really tried not to burden, frontline workers with tons of debt or the businesses with tons of debt. So once we have the proof of concept up and running, we've really relied on grant systems, grant funding after that. So if you go to the industrialcommons.org/about, you can see all the different funders we have. But really, it's been in the newer co-ops and the newer programs and enterprises that we've been starting, it's really been the grant funding. So it's the nonprofit that takes the grant funding to Maya, the $1 million machine, that takes the textile waste and combines it with virgin materials to create a new sock out of old textile waste. So we operate the machine, the worker owners operate the machine. The machine is owned by the nonprofit. And we use the nonprofit 501c3 to bring in the grant funding.
Amazing. Thank you both. I think that there's a lot that we could unpack at another time, but hopefully that is fuel to the fire for many of you listening and grappling with similar questions in terms of different sources of capital and creatively leveraging legal infrastructure plus financial partners to make these ideas come to life. So I want to thank you, Don and Aaron, for being in the hot seat and sharing more, inviting us into your community, your space, so that we could hear the stories and learn from them, and identifying also, again, the success factors that we've noted in the book of regionalism, place-based strategy, conscious consolidation, seed assets as well. So that wraps up our panel, and I will pass it back to Chelsea for our Q&A segment.
Thank you so much. And there are so many people who, if we could spend a whole day together in this whole group, we could hear so many more stories. And I would just really encourage all of you to dive into the book to really grapple with some of those details. I think we just started scratching the surface there, and I know that everyone probably wants a little bit more. As a reminder, those are two amazing case studies from the United States and that are existing and thriving in the current moment. There's a number of other examples from outside the United States. We have like financial interdependence examples, banking examples, currency examples. There are so many different points that are raised in the book. So just really want to emphasize the diversity there as well. So as we transition towards the end of our time together today, we're going to take a few questions. I did see a couple come in on the chat, but I also just want everyone to just take a breath. You've just heard a lot of things, and take a moment to just kind of figure out for yourself if you want to ask a question. So take a minute. If you do have a question, put it in the chat, and just let us know what you're thinking. We do have a longish one here from Jessie Kate Shingler. Jessie, if you want to unmute yourself and ask that question in the shortest way you can phrase it, that would be amazing. And who are you directing that question to, or would you like all of us to comment a little bit as well?
Thanks, Chelsea. Yeah, first of all, this is just incredibly inspiring work. So thank you everybody who's been doing it for, the last year plus. It's really heroes work. I guess, it came up for me, I think when you were first presenting. So, you, or if anybody wants to share on this, it's really a question about balancing the tension of efficiency versus culture and kind of agency in shared services, which sound like they're like a really interesting knob to turn in terms of supporting shared ownership ventures. But sometimes in search of efficiency, we can lose some of the values and goals that we started off with. I'm just wondering what you found in terms of the groups that you've been working with, if anybody was balancing that well, or if there are any good patterns that emerged.
So balancing culture, relationality, and values with efficiency gains and scale.
Mm-hmm. From shared services in particular.
Mm.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question, Jesse. And I'm actually going to invite Jay to even also speak to this as well, given his insights on specifically shared services and various businesses that are utilizing those. I will say some of the I'll maybe speak to the relationality and culture piece, maybe a little bit more broadly first. And one of the things that we find, and I would say across all of the examples, is that there was a lot of strong focus and intentionality on setting purpose, on setting the culture of the I would say interior, like between the employees and leaders of the companies themselves. Again, this is like speaking at the broad level related to that piece. The founders of the organizations or the leaders of the organizations really brought that to the forefront and something that they wanted to hold, and then we're grappling with and looking for the right structure that would help them maintain that value system up front. Jay, I don't know if you want to speak maybe more specifically to the operational efficiency piece.
Sure, yeah. And one of the quintessential examples of shared services that we like to give is a group called Carpet One, which is could call it a network of about 4,000 independently owned flooring stores. It's actually international, but mostly in the United States, that collectively co-own a shared services cooperative that pools all of their purchasing so that they can compete with big box stores on price, and also has a nationally recognized brand called Carpet One that is a co-owned brand. So they can all appear to be a sort of chain store, but actually it's sort of an upside down franchise where the local businesses are independently owned by local operators that then co-own this shared infrastructure. And also they do sort of operational best practices, professionalization, that kind of thing. And part of the focus of this is not only the local organizations run their own operations so they can, have whatever culture they want, and they are not beholden to a corporate overlord, so to speak, that they're not, answering to managers that might impose a corporate level operations plan that the local groups will say, we're doing things fine. They work for us in this environment, and now we're having to change the way we do things because some boardroom decision happened that we actually don't agree with. And so that doesn't happen in a shared services cooperative structure like this. And one of the key distinctions in the other direction is that the local groups not only co-own but co-manage the broader cooperative. So they have a governance role in guiding the central or the shared infrastructure layer. So it's actually culture is going up rather than the other way around.
Thank you both. We do have a couple of questions for Dawn in the chat here that are structural and related to how GoodWorks Evergreen operates. Let me just read those out really quickly. So one of them is the holding company, does the structure of the holding company incorporate employee ownership in its format? And then the second one is, were there any concerns raised by business owners when you were converting them into your holding company structure?
Great questions. Thank you for both. First of all, we've been operating as GoodWorks Ventures and the High Stakes Foundation in our community for more than 12 years before we started any of this. So our reputation as people who try to make things happen in a good way preceded us, opened some doors to be sure. And once we had our first acquisition, all of our subsequent acquisitions talked to everybody who we had bought a business from before we had bought that business from them. And we received pretty high marks from most people about the way we conduct ourselves in our businesses and our approach and our fairness. And, you know, we've tried our best to make our acquisition documents as user-friendly as possible, keep the legalese to a minimum, to try to make transactions as easy as possible for all parties. That's sometimes not been always to our advantage, where we wantonly removed lawyer language that came back to bite us, but live and learn on those sorts of things. With respect to employee ownership, it's been something that we've really we will get there, but it wasn't at the outset. Meaning, at the outset, the businesses we were buying were generally paying their employees $10 or $12 an hour with no benefits whatsoever. And we were not about to set about taking over jobs that weren't worth keeping. So we raised everyone to $15 and subsequently to $20 an hour with a 401k and health insurance. And I will say this, there was an enormous pushback from many, many of our employees who are in their 50s and 60s even about health insurance. They didn't want it. They wanted us to just give them the money. And we insisted on providing health insurance. We reward our managers as if they're owners. If we make money, they're taking a pretty nice hefty slice off the top so that they act as if it's their own business, and meet with us quarterly just to sort of set goals. And we provide all the back end holding company function like HR and all the things that you need to deal with, the tax people, the quarterly payments, the blah, 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 the bank financing, etc. So our managers really are free to do what they do best, which is manage the business, and they don't take the risk. With respect to broad-based employee ownership, as most of you know, there's a huge education component that goes along with that. And getting your employees on board, we have not managed to get there yet. We are looking at setting up a perpetual trust company where the owners may not be owners, but they'll be beneficiaries at least of the business, because I'm not sure that some of our people will ever get to ownership if I'm having such a hard time with health insurance. But we're working on it. We'll get there.
Thank you so much, Dawn. And as we kind of start looking at the time here, I know we have around about 10 minutes remaining on the call altogether. I just want to mention that there are a few different key points that are being raised in the chat. People are talking about co-ops. We've just talked about employee ownership. We talked about steward ownership earlier. There are tons of different alternative ownership concepts that are all relevant to this conversation. We didn't take an approach where we necessarily had a strong bias towards any one given structure in this research project. However, what we did look at was how you can kind of pool assets between these kinds of entities to make them more competitive and resilient, right? And so if you are the manager of a co-op, if you are the manager even of just a privately owned small business, if you're the manager of a steward-owned piece of land run by a church, these are all relevant growth and scale strategies for your assets regardless, because we were kind of model neutral, if you will, and the variety of models you can learn more about. So just wanted to point that out, because I think that is part of the discussion here is that there's such a diversity of people in the room, and everyone comes from slightly different angles on the alternative ownership discussion. So I want to point out that. But on the other hand, we did in the end, develop a bias towards steward ownership because we realized that there were so many additional positive externalities that could be generated when you put some of these assets into trust ownership or nonprofit ownership. And so I would definitely encourage, if anyone isn't familiar with steward ownership structures, to just get a little bit more educated on that, because we found that to be particularly advantageous, especially when looking at holding company structures. So as we come towards the end of our time, I'm wondering if we might actually want to take a couple of closing comments from our speakers today. If there are any additional points that our co-authors want to mention, if anything didn't get said that we really want to get across. And again, we are fully happy to either sit on here past the hour and take additional questions, or we can also do Q&A by email, whatever you guys would want if anything comes to you after this. But Jay, Charity, Derek, Dawn, Aaron, is there anything else you want to say as we sort of start to head towards wrap up today?
I'll just pipe in and say that there's a concept of the Trimurti, and it's the creation, maintenance, and destruction cycle, that in order to create something, you're going to have to maintain it. And in order to be able to create something again, you generally have to destroy that thing you created. And I think really understanding your own bias and predisposition to where you fit within that triangle is really useful. I'm a great creator. My interest in maintaining hardware stores is not all that awesome. So I found some great maintainers for my team so that we can maybe go about creating something new that's being asked for in our community. But I've just found that concept to be really helpful personally.
I want to riff off that because I think that resonates with just a lot. Again, I just keep really appreciating, Don, what you were saying. I mean, I think I've tried to keep saying, like, you've got to find the person who likes doing business if you're doing a business-based, kind of community development project. I'm stealing this from Melissa Hoover, former executive director of Democracy at Work Institute, but it's like typically you've got the co-op developers, the nonprofit, and they have skills, and then you find folks in the organization that are going to be doing the job and they have skills, and typically there's a gap somewhere. So what Don just said, that gap was like, oh, I need someone who's going to enjoy running the hardware store. That's the gap. You got to look at the gap, and I think oftentimes nonprofits and funders encourage you to paper over the gap, right? Again, this is all from Melissa Hoover, but so what you have to do is you have to look real hard at the gap, and if you want this enterprise to be successful, you've got to identify what don't we have that we need to get in order for this to be a successful project or enterprise. So again, just resonate a lot with everything Don has said today.
Yeah, I would just, I think the last point for me would be like, we embarked on this research project, not because we love doing research. And in fact, like, for me as somebody who is more interested in like building things, we had to like hold our nose a little bit, or I had to hold my nose a little bit to be like, let's do some research, because I am so sensitive about taking the time of people like Dawn and Aaron to be like, sit down with us and tell us about the thing that you're like working 80 hours a week on. I do think that so I just want to kind of come back to highlight the importance of the role of people like building and doing and maintaining all of those roles in this space, because I think that it's very easy. It's a sort of reality of spaces like this with a lot of like nonprofits and sort of support organizations and stuff that we do a lot of, including us, we like do a lot of talking, but it's like so critical to have people on the ground who are building things like in a community with assets, like building portfolio, like that work is so critical. And so this book is really like it's like a love letter to the people who are like building the new economy, because it's often those folks don't have the time to go out and tell their own story about the details of how they did the thing because they're doing the thing. And so we're just like trying to honor that as much as possible, and really appreciate you guys jumping on as well.
I would just quickly plus one, riff off a little bit what Derek just mentioned. I think the research project, we're just scratching the surface. It doesn't encapsulate every single possibility, but because the desired audience is builders and their ecosystem, the hope is that through the case studies that there's a light switch that turns on, or a connection that is made, And you'll see and find that much of what we discussed there are structural elements for, I think we talked about governance and decision making without using those terms from these from some of the examples already shared. But then there's the connective tissues is kind of a term that we use to describe it. The connective tissues of, is it a digital platform service? Is it shared services as an entity? Is it real estate? And so for everyone on this call to really, there's one key takeaway, go back and think about what are the assets that you as a person, you as a leader, as a participant in this broader ecosystem, you as an organization builder, what are those assets that you have to bring to the table, and really taking that collaborative view and approach to put the book into action. I think someone had a question or comment related to that. What does it look like to actually activate this? And it is all of us saying, okay, let's do it. So that would be my closing notes and takeaway for everyone on this call.
Yeah, absolutely. And builders and entrepreneurs and folks who are both those creators and the maintainers and potentially the creative destroyers as our target audience. If you think of someone, or you know someone, or you are someone who has some of these qualities, don't hesitate to recommend the book to them, shoot them the assetsincommon.org website. And, really, I learned so much by doing this project. A lot of these case studies, a lot of these concepts were completely new to me. There was a list that Derek sent. I was like, never heard of that, never heard of that, never heard of that, never heard of that when we started. And then we sort of wrote the book based on these ideas. And so I think they are a lot of ideas that once you read about them, they will make sense to you. And they are different than what you're normally accustomed to seeing. So I would just highly encourage a deep scan and hopefully a full read of the book, because
Awesome.
there really is a lot of good stuff in there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. I just wanted to wrap by saying, check out that website. I've put the link in the chat. Please share it with anyone who you think needs to learn more about this. This is for people who want to build stuff. It's really a gift to the ecosystem and a strategy for the future of the alternative ownership sector. So please do share it with people who need to receive it. There is a PDF available of that book on that website, and by this time next week, you will also be able to buy a print version, although that option is not available as of today. There is also a full podcast series about the book in depth on that website, and there are a number of different media articles floating around today, especially from Elias Krim, who's on the call, and from Shareable. Neil's on the call from Shareable. So check it out, circulate any of those pieces of media if you want to. Thank you so much for coming. And our contact form on the website gets sent to all 5 co-authors. So if you ever want to reach us, just use that contact form. Thank you very much, everybody.